They say an alpha who refuses his mate is a king standing on the edge of his own grave. King Kalen Ardent Virion has said no 312 times. 3 years of rejection carved into marble floors, into the faces of noble women who came offering bloodlines and alliances, into the silence that now defines an empire built on conquest and fear. Tonight, he will say it again. And tonight, everything he has built to protect himself will shatter in ways he cannot control and cannot survive alone. If you're ready to witness what happens when power meets the one thing it cannot dominate, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know where my tribe is watching from. Because this story does not ask for your comfort, it demands your attention. The throne hall of Viralith Citadel stretched like a cathedral of conquered ambition, all black marble veined with gold that caught the light from chandeliers burning with crystallized fire. The ceiling disappeared into shadows that swallowed sound, making every footstep, every breath, every whispered judgment echo like a verdict handed down from something older than law. King Kalen, Ardent Virion, stood beneath that impossible height, alone on a dais built from the bones of 3 overthrown kingdoms. He wore black embroidered with silver thread that moved like water when he breathed, but he barely moved at all. His face was the kind of beautiful that made people afraid to look directly at it. Sharp enough to cut, cold enough to freeze, eyes the color of winter storms that had forgotten how to thaw. He had been standing there for 4 hours. The court had learned not to complain. At the base of the dais, Corvin Drell watched with the patient amusement of a man who had orchestrated every moment leading to this one. Advisor to the king, architect of imperial policy, a man who smiled like he was always 3 moves ahead and enjoyed letting you know it. His robes were deep crimson, tailored to perfection, hands folded behind his back as if he were observing a theater performance he had written himself. The line of noblewomen stretched through the hall like a procession of gilded desperation. House Valterra, House Morene, House Cray, daughters of generals, nieces of governors, women trained since childhood to stand beside power and wield it without flinching. One by one, they approached. One by one, Kalen destroyed them. Lady Saris of House Valterra stepped forward first, her gown a waterfall of emerald silk that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. She was beautiful in the way weapons were beautiful, precise, deadly, confident. She smiled as she reached the dais, tilting her head in the exact angle of respect that acknowledged authority without submitting to it. Kalen did not look at her. Lady Saris, the king will hear your petition, Corvin announced, his voice smooth as polished glass. Saris straightened, her voice clear and controlled. My king, House Valterra offers alliance forged through 6 generations of military excellence. Our bloodline has defended the northern territories since before the Virion crown existed. I come not as a stranger, but as the daughter of the man who held the borderlands when your enemies thought they could break through. Kalen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No. The word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. No ripples, no echo. Just wait. Saris blinked. Her smile did not falter, but something behind her eyes cracked. She opened her mouth to speak again. Kalen turned his head a fraction of an inch, just enough that his gaze passed over her like she had already ceased to exist. Saris held her position for 3 seconds longer than pride should have allowed. Then she stepped back, her face a mask carved from bone-white marble, and walked the length of the hall in absolute silence. The doors closed behind her with the finality of a crypt ceiling. Corvin gestured to the next woman in line. Lady Thessa of House Moren approached with the kind of grace that came from studying every movement in a mirror until it became performance. Her gown was white, threaded with gold, her dark hair pinned with diamonds that caught the light like trapped stars. She did not smile. My king, I offer no speeches of lineage or conquest. I offer only this. I have studied the architecture of power since I could read. I know what it costs. I know what it demands. I do not come asking to share your crown. I come offering to carry the weight you cannot show. For the first time that night, Kalen looked directly at someone. His eyes met hers and held. Silence stretched between them like a bridge made of glass. The court leaned forward without realizing it. Thessa's breath caught. No. Her face went blank. Not hurt. Not anger. Just nothing. She turned and walked away as if she had always known this would be the answer and had come anyway to confirm that hope was as useless as they said. The procession continued. Lady Varin of House Cray, rejected. Lady Alara of House Kess, rejected. The daughter of the Eastern Governor, the niece of the Trade Council head, a woman who had killed 3 men in duels to prove she was strong enough to stand beside an Alpha King. No. 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 Each rejection landed heavier than the last. Not because Kalen raised his voice or offered explanation, because he did not. Because refusal delivered without justification was the most complete form of erasure. By the 10th rejection, sweat had begun to bead on the back of Kalen's neck despite the cool air. His hands ached from being clenched so tightly. Every woman who approached carried the ghost of his mother's face. Every offer of partnership whispered the promises his father had believed before betrayal turned them to ash. After the 12th rejection, Corvin stepped forward, his smile still perfectly in place. My king, perhaps a brief recess would serve the court well. Kalen did not answer. His throat was dry, his chest tight. But stopping meant acknowledging weakness, and weakness was the first crack in the foundation he had spent years building. Corvin's smile thinned. Very well. He gestured to the guards. Bring forward the next offering. The phrasing made several nobles shift uncomfortably. The guards returned with someone who did not belong. Lyra Ashland stumbled into the throne hall like she had been shoved through a door she did not know existed. She was 16, maybe 17, small and terrified in a dress that was too fine for her and fit wrong at the shoulders. Her hair had been pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Her hands shook. She was from the Hollow District, the lower city, the place where people went when the Empire forgot they existed. The court went silent in a different way. Not anticipation, disgust. Corvin's voice rang out like a town crier announcing a public execution. Lyra Ashlyn, daughter of the Hollow, presented as proof that even the lowest among us may seek the grace of imperial selection. It was a lie dressed as mercy. Everyone in the hall knew it. This was not opportunity. This was theater. A demonstration of power so absolute that it could drag a girl from the gutter and humiliate her in front of the Empire just to remind everyone what rejection looked like when it was truly cruel. Lyra took 3 steps forward and stopped. Her eyes were wide, glassy with unshed tears. She looked at Kalen like he was something vast and incomprehensible, a force of nature she had been thrown into without warning. She was trembling so hard her knees knocked together. Kalen looked back. Something in his expression shifted, not softening, fracturing. He saw what everyone else refused to see. She was a child, she was bait, she was being used. And for the first time in 3 years, King Kalen Ardent Virion felt something other than cold calculation. He felt disgust, not at her, at himself, at what he had become, at what he allowed his court to become, at the machine of cruelty that operated in his name and with his silent permission. No, he said, but this time his voice was different, quieter, almost human. The word came out cracked at the edges, rough with something that might have been shame if he still allowed himself to feel such things. Lyra flinched as if the word had struck her physically. She backed away, tripping over the hem of the dress, catching herself on nothing, and then ran. Not walked, ran. The sound of her footsteps disappeared into the corridor beyond, swallowed by stone and shadow. The court erupted in murmurs that Corvin allowed for exactly 10 seconds before raising one hand. Silence fell. Proceed with the final selections, Corvin said, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had. In the service corridor beyond the grand doors, hidden in the fractured light that bled through marble lattice, Lyra Ashlyn watched everything. She was 23, lean and angular in a way that came from skipping meals and working twice as hard as anyone else just to stay alive. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a braid that was practical rather than decorative. Her hands were scarred from years of labor in the lower districts, carrying water, hauling supplies, doing whatever needed doing to keep her and Lyra fed. Her nails were chipped, her knuckles were swollen from yesterday's shift loading grain sacks at the docks. Her feet ached in boots that were 2 sizes too small because they were the only pair she owned. She had come because she knew what the court was doing to her sister. She had stayed because she could not look away. Now, watching Lyra run past her in tears, Something inside Lara cracked open like a dam that had been holding back floodwater for too long. She thought about the years of bowing her head, of swallowing words that would get her killed, of accepting that some people mattered and some people were just scenery in someone else's story. She thought about every time someone with power had looked through her like she was glass, and she decided she was done. She stepped into the hall. No one noticed at first. She was dressed in the plain gray uniform of the servant class, anonymous by design, someone the nobility had been trained not to see. She walked forward with the kind of steady purpose that came from having nothing left to lose. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her footsteps did not falter. Corvin was mid-sentence, gesturing toward the next noblewoman in line, when Lara's voice cut through the air like a blade drawn in the dark. Enough. Every head turned. Lyra stopped 10 feet from the dais, her shoulders squared, her hands open at her sides. She was not armed. She was not protected. She was simply there, refusing to be invisible. Corvin's smile evaporated. Guards, remove this disturbance. Lyra ignored him. She looked directly at Kaelin, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the hall with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute conviction. You call this selection. You call it law. You call it tradition. But what I see is cruelty dressed up as ceremony. You dragged my sister into this hall to humiliate her, not to choose her, not to honor her, to remind the Empire that even a king's rejection is a gift when it comes from someone with power. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kaelin did not move, did not blink, but his gaze locked onto Lyra with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. For 3 years, no one had spoken to him like this. For 3 years, every word addressed to him had been filtered through layers of formality and fear. And now this woman, this servant with dirt under her fingernails and fire in her eyes, stood in his throne hall and called his authority exactly what it was: a performance of dominance disguised as duty. Corvin stepped forward, his voice sharp as broken glass. You dare address the king without permission? You dare question imperial law? Lyra turned to him, and her expression was colder than anything the court had seen from a servant. I dare question what you call law when it is just power deciding who deserves dignity and who does not. Corvin's hand moved toward the guards. Kaelin's voice stopped him. Wait. One word. Absolute authority. Corvin froze mid-gesture, his smile replaced by something harder. Kaelin descended the dais slowly, each step deliberate, measured. He moved like a predator that had identified something unexpected. Not prey, not threat. Something else. He stopped 3 feet from Lyra. Up close, she could see the fractures in his control, the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion carved into the edges of his eyes, the way his hands were clenched at his sides as if he were holding something back that wanted to break free. She could see the faint scar along his collarbone where a blade had come too close, the slight asymmetry in his shoulders from an old injury that had healed wrong, the way he breathed too carefully, like a man who had learned to ration even air. He was not a myth. He was a man who had turned himself into one because being human had cost him everything. Who are you? Kaelin asked. Lyra Ashlyn. Lyra's sister. No title, no house, no bloodline worth mentioning, just someone who came to make sure my sister survived what you put her through. And what do you think I put her through? Public humiliation disguised as opportunity. You knew you would reject her before she walked in here. Everyone knew. But you let it happen anyway, because this is not about choosing a queen. This is about reminding everyone that you can say no, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. Kaelin's expressions did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Recognition. Not of her. Of the truth in what she said. You speak as if you understand me, he said quietly. I do not need to understand you to see what you are doing. And what am I doing? Lyra stepped closer. Near enough that the guards tensed, hands moving toward weapons. You are turning yourself into a myth. You are building a wall so high that no one can reach you, and you think that makes you strong. But all I see is someone terrified of what might happen if someone actually got close enough to see you are just as human as the rest of us. The hall held its breath. Kaelin stared at her like she had just spoken a language he thought was extinct. And then it happened. The bond ignited. Not gently, not gradually. It struck like lightning finding ground, a force that bypassed logic and reason and consent, tearing through both of them with a violence that left no room for doubt. Lyra gasped, her knees buckling as the sensation tore through her chest, spreading like fire beneath her skin. It was not pain, it was presence. Overwhelming, undeniable. The sense of another consciousness folding into hers, vast and cold and absolutely certain. Her vision blurred, her lungs seized. Every nerve ending in her body lit up like she had been struck by something fundamental and irrevocable. Kaelin staggered. The Alpha King, who had stood unmoving for 3 years, took a single step backward and caught himself on nothing, his hand going to his chest as if something had just pierced him through. His breath came out in a sharp exhale that sounded like it had been punched out of him. For a moment, the only sound was breathing, ragged, uneven, synchronized. Then the court erupted. Voices overlapped, shouting, denying, demanding explanation. Guards moved forward, nobles backed away. Corvin stood frozen, his expression flickering between shock and something darker. The bond pulled tighter. Lyra could feel him now. Not thoughts, not words, but presence. The weight of him in her awareness like gravity. She had not known existed until it locked into place. She could feel his heartbeat as if it were her own, could sense the fracture lines in his control, could taste the fear underneath the ice. And it was suffocating. Because she did not want this, did not ask for this, did not choose to be tied to a man who built empires on the principle that attachment was weakness. But the bond did not care what she wanted. It simply was. Kaelin raised one hand. Silence. Absolute. He looked at Lyra, and she looked back, both of them still reeling from what had just locked into place between them. His eyes were the color of winter, but for the first time she saw something else beneath the frost. Terror. Raw. Unfiltered. The kind of fear that comes from losing control of the one thing you built your entire life to protect. Arrest her, Kaelin said. His voice was steady. His face was unreadable, but his hand was still pressed against his chest, as if trying to hold something inside that was fighting to break free. The guard seized Lyra before she could react, hands gripping her arms hard enough to bruise. She did not fight. She was still trying to understand what had just happened, why her entire body felt like it was being pulled toward someone she had just met, why the distance between them suddenly felt like suffocation. Kaelin turned away. Take her to the lower cells, he ordered. No visitors, no exceptions. Corvin stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. My king, the bond, Kaelin cut him off, is a complication, nothing more. My king, the law states that a bonded pair... I said nothing more. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Lyra was dragged from the hall, her eyes locked on Kaelin, until the doors closed between them and the connection snapped taut like a chain pulled to its limit. Pain lanced through her chest. Not physical. Worse. The bond screaming that distance was wrong, that separation was damage, that every step away from him was a wound that would not heal. She gasped, stumbling, and the guards hauled her forward without mercy. The moment she disappeared, Kaelin's control cracked. He took the stairs back to the dais in 3 strides and stood there, breathing hard, his hands braced on the arms of the throne as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Corvin approached carefully. My king? Leave. Everyone. Now. The court emptied in under 2 minutes. When the hall was finally silent, Kaelin sat down slowly, his head falling into his hands. For the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King allowed himself to feel what he had spent every waking moment suppressing. Not power, loneliness, and now, impossibly, something worse. Connection. To someone he could not control, could not predict, could not afford to need. He had built an empire on the principle that attachment was weakness, and in less than 5 minutes, a servant girl with no name and no power had proven him catastrophically wrong. Not by breaking him, by making him feel whole, and that, more than any rebellion, any betrayal, any war, was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to King Kaelin Ardent Virion, because power, he understood. Power had rules. Power had logic. Power could be controlled through discipline and strategy and the willingness to sacrifice everything that made you vulnerable. But peace was a weapon he had no defense against. It demanded trust. It required openness. It asked him to believe that connection would not end in betrayal and blood and the kind of loss that turned men into ghosts. And he could not. would not. He had watched his mother die because someone she trusted put poison in her wine. He had watched his father follow her into the grave 3 months later because the bond between them made survival without her unthinkable. He had been 15 years old, standing in a throne room, very much like this one, watching the two people who were supposed to be immortal prove that even alphas could be destroyed by love. The empire had nearly collapsed. Civil war had erupted in 6 provinces. It had taken Kaelin 3 years of brutal, systematic warfare to reclaim the throne, and another 5 to rebuild the infrastructure of power. And every single day of those 8 years, he had promised himself one thing: never again. Never again would he allow himself to become the kind of target his parents had been. Never again would he give anyone the leverage to destroy him through something as simple as caring. He had turned himself into stone, into ice, into something that could rule without feeling and decide without attachment. It had worked. Until tonight. Until a woman with dirt under her fingernails and defiance in her eyes had walked into his throne hall and shattered every defense he had built without even trying. Kaelin pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw stars. The bond pulled tighter, a constant ache in his chest that whispered she was underground. She was afraid. She was in pain because of distance he had created. And part of him wanted to go to her, wanted to descend into the dungeons and pull her out and demand answers to questions he did not know how to ask. Wanted to know why her presence felt like the first full breath he had taken in years. But the larger part, the part that had kept him alive through assassination attempts and coups and betrayals too numerous to count, knew exactly what would happen if he gave in. He would start to need her, and need was the door through which every nightmare walked. So he sat in the silence of his throne hall, alone with the weight of a crown that suddenly felt heavier than it ever had, and made a decision. She would die. Not because she deserved it, because he could not survive what she represented. And survival was the only thing that mattered. Details. The dungeons beneath Virulith Citadel were not designed for rehabilitation. They were designed to break people slowly, methodically, until there was nothing left but compliance or madness. Lyra sat in a cell carved from black stone. No windows, no light except the faint glow of a torch somewhere down the corridor. The walls were damp. The air smelled like rust and old fear. She could still feel him. It made no sense. She had been dragged half a mile underground, locked behind iron and stone, separated by distance and walls, and every physical barrier the Citadel could provide. And still, she felt him. A pull in her chest that would not let go. A presence at the edge of her awareness that whispered wrong, wrong, wrong every time she tried to ignore it. She pressed her palms against the stone floor and focused on breathing. In, out, in, out. The bond did not care. It tightened like a fist around her lungs, demanding acknowledgement, demanding proximity, demanding something she could not give. Her skin felt too tight. Her heartbeat was erratic, skipping beats and then racing to catch up. Sweat soaked through her shirt despite the cold. This was not metaphorical. This was physical. The bond was doing something to her body, rewriting her nervous system to make distance from him feel like dying. She had heard stories about bonded pairs, myths from the old districts, tales about alphas who could not survive the death of their mates, about connections so deep that separation felt like amputation. She had never believed them. Now she was living one. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Lyra stood, her back against the far wall, as a figure appeared beyond the bars. Corvin Drell. He stood in the torchlight like a portrait of reasonable authority, his hands folded, his expression calm. He looked at her the way someone might look at an insect under glass. Curious, clinical, mildly entertained. "Miss Ashlyn," he said, "I imagine you have questions." Lyra did not answer. Her throat was too tight. The bond was pulling so hard now that speaking felt like it would break something inside her. Corvin smiled. "Allow me to save you the effort. You are wondering why you are still alive. You are wondering what the king intends to do with you. You are wondering if the bond you feel is real or if you have simply lost your mind." Lyra's jaw tightened. Corvin stepped closer to the bars. "The bond is real. Rare, but real. In the old texts, they called it the alpha bond, a connection between two individuals whose presence stabilizes one another. It cannot be faked, it cannot be forced, and it cannot be severed except through death. Then why am I down here? Because the king is afraid." Lyra blinked. Corvin's smile widened. "Oh, he will not admit it. He will frame your imprisonment as necessity, as protection of the throne, as a dozen other justifications that sound rational and measured. But the truth is simpler. Kalen Ardent Virion has spent 3 years ensuring no one could get close enough to hurt him. And you, Miss Ashlyn, got closer in 5 minutes than anyone has in a lifetime. Lyra's hands curled into fists. If the bond is real, then executing me would kill him too. Not kill. Wound deeply. But alphas have survived worse. Pain is temporary. Vulnerability is permanent. And Kalen would rather suffer the rest of his life than risk trusting someone again. Again? Corvin tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was deciding whether to solve. You do not know his history. Of course you do not. Let me enlighten you. Kalen's parents ruled this empire together. His father was a conqueror. His mother was a strategist. They were bonded, as you are now. The strongest alpha pair the empire had seen in 3 generations. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. And when his mother was assassinated by someone they trusted, his father did not survive the grief. Kalen watched both of them die within a year. He was 15. Lyra felt something cold settle in her chest. The bond pulled tighter, and for a moment she could feel Kalen's presence sharpen on the other end, as if he sensed she was learning something he had never wanted her to know. Corvin continued, his voice soft, almost gentle. He learned early that attachment is a blade someone else gets to hold, that love is just another word for weakness waiting to be exploited, and he has built his entire reign on ensuring no one ever holds that blade again. The bond you share is not a gift to him, Miss Ashlyn. It is a threat, and threats are eliminated. Then why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand that your death is not personal. It is policy. Lyra stepped forward, close enough to the bars that she could see the torchlight reflected in Corvin's eyes. And what do you get out of it? Corvin's smile did not waver. Stability. A king who remains unbonded is a king who cannot be manipulated through emotional leverage. I have spent years cultivating that stability, advising him, guiding him, ensuring that every decision he makes serves the empire rather than his own heart. I will not allow it to collapse because fate decided to play games. Lyra stared at him. You are not protecting him. You are controlling him. I am protecting the empire. Whether Kalen lives or dies is secondary to that goal. Whether you live or die is incidental. He turned to leave. Lyra's voice stopped him. He is going to break. Corvin glanced back. Lyra met his gaze without flinching. You think you know him. You think you have him controlled. But I felt what happened when the bond formed. He is not afraid of me. He is afraid of what he feels when I am near. And fear like that does not stay buried. It explodes. Corvin studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled again, wider this time. I certainly hope so, he said quietly, and he walked away, leaving Lyra alone in the dark with the suffocating weight of a bond that demanded she survive, and a king who had already decided she could not. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and pressed her hands to her chest where the bond burned like a brand. She could feel him, not thoughts, not emotions, but presence. And beneath the ice and the control and the carefully constructed distance, she could feel something else. Pain, old, deep. The kind of wound that never healed because healing meant acknowledging it existed. Kalen Ardent Virion was not a king who refused to choose. He was a survivor who had learned that choosing meant losing, and losing meant the kind of destruction that turned children into weapons. And now the bond had forced him into the one choice he had spent his entire life avoiding: trust or destroy. Connect or survive. Somewhere far above, in chambers sealed behind marble and steel, Kalen Ardent Virion stood at a window overlooking the city and felt the bond pull tighter with every breath. He had not slept. He would not allow himself to, because every time he closed his eyes, he felt her, not as an intrusion, as stillness. The chaotic noise in his mind that had been his constant companion for 15 years went quiet when she was near. The calculations, the strategies, the endless assessment of threat and counter-threat, all of it faded into something that felt disturbingly close to peace. And that terrified him more than anything else in his life ever had. Because the last time he had felt safe, everyone he loved had died, and he would burn the world before he let that happen again, even if it meant burning himself in the process. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, and made himself say the words out loud. She dies at dawn. The Bond screamed in protest, a sharp lance of pain that drove him to his knees. He stayed there, gasping, feeling the connection fracture and reform and fracture again as his mind warred with something deeper, something fundamental, that refused to accept what he knew had to happen. Below, in the dungeons, Lyra felt the same pain tear through her and understood with absolute clarity what it meant. He had made his choice. And in 3 hours, when the sun rose over Viralith's citadel, the bond that had ignited between a king and a servant would end the only way it could when one half refused to surrender. In blood. In silence. In the kind of loss that proved fear was always right to warn you that hope was just another word for the weapon that would kill you. The hours before dawn were the longest Kaelin had ever lived. He stood in his private chambers, surrounded by walls he had ordered built thicker than any fortress, and felt them closing in. The bond was a living thing now, not metaphor, not abstraction, a presence that wrapped around his lungs and squeezed every time he tried to convince himself that what he had ordered was necessary. She dies at dawn. He had said it out loud, had given the command to his guards, had watched them nod and leave to make the arrangements, and now his body was tearing itself apart in protest. His hands shook, not from fear, from the effort of keeping them still. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. His heartbeat was erratic, hammering against his ribs like something trying to break free. This was not supposed to happen. Alphas did not break. Alphas endured. That was the entire foundation of what made them different from everyone else. The capacity to survive what would destroy ordinary men. But the bond did not care what he was supposed to be. It cared only that she was in pain, and he was the one causing it. A knock at the door shattered the silence. "Enter." His voice came out rougher than he intended. Commander Thane stepped inside, a man built like a siege weapon, scarred from decades of warfare that had carved loyalty into his bones. He had served Kaelin's father, had carried a 15-year-old boy out of a burning throne room when assassins came for what remained of the royal bloodline, had never questioned a single order in 20 years. Until now. Thane closed the door behind him and stood at attention, but his expression was carved from stone. "My king." Kaelin did not turn from the window. "Speak. The execution is scheduled for dawn. The headsman is prepared. The court has been notified. Everything is in order." Silence. Thane did not move. Kaelin's jaw tightened. "Then why are you still here?" "Because I have served you long enough to know when you are making a mistake." The temperature in the room dropped. Kaelin turned slowly, his eyes flat and cold. "You forget yourself, Commander." "No, my king. I remember you." Thane stepped forward, and there was something in his voice that cut through rank and protocol. "I remember a boy who survived hell because he refused to become the men who created it. I remember a king who built an empire on the principle that power without restraint is just tyranny dressed in better clothes. And I am watching that king prepare to execute an innocent woman because he is too afraid to admit he feels something." Kaelin's hands curled into fists. "She is not innocent. She disrupted imperial law. She spoke the truth, and you felt it. And now you want her dead because the bond proved you wrong about everything you built your life to protect." "Careful, Thane." "No." The commander's voice was hard as iron. "You can execute me after if you want. But you will hear this first. Your mother died because someone poisoned her. Your father died because he could not survive without her. That was not the bond's fault. That was betrayal. And you have spent 15 years punishing yourself for something you could not control by ensuring you never have to trust anyone again." Kaelin's breath came faster. Thane did not stop. "But the bond does not care about your fear. It does not care about your strategy. It is asking you one question. Are you strong enough to survive connection, or are you only strong enough to survive alone? Get out. My king, get out before I have you removed." Thane held his gaze for 3 seconds longer than subordination allowed. Then he saluted, turned, and left. The door closed. Kaelin stood in the silence and felt something inside him crack, not breaking, splintering, because Thane was right, and that made it worse. The bond pulled tighter, and Kaelin gasped, doubling over as pain lanced through his chest. He caught himself on the edge of his desk, knuckles white, breathing hard. This was what his father had felt. This was the trap his mother had walked into willingly. This was the weakness that had destroyed them both, and he would not repeat their mistakes. He straightened, forced his breathing to steady, and spoke to the empty room. "It ends at dawn." The bond screamed. He ignored it. Bok. In the dungeons, Lyra had stopped fighting, not because she had given up, because fighting the bond was like fighting gravity, pointless, exhausting, a waste of energy she would need if she was going to survive the next 3 hours. She sat against the wall, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold the pieces together through sheer force of will. The bond was quieter now. Not gone. Never gone. But it had shifted from screaming to something worse. Mourning. As if it knew what was coming and had already begun the process of tearing itself apart. She could feel him on the other end, could sense the war happening inside him, the way his mind kept circling back to the same conclusion no matter how many times the bond tried to pull him away from it. He was going to kill her. Not because he wanted to, because he believed he had to, and there was a certain clarity in that. Lyra had spent her entire life watching people with power make decisions that destroyed people without it. Had learned early that survival meant accepting you did not get to choose your circumstances, only how you responded to them. She had responded by refusing to disappear, by standing in a throne hall and calling a king's cruelty exactly what it was, by forcing him to see her as something other than scenery in his carefully controlled empire. And now she would die for it. But at least she would die as herself. Not as someone who bowed. Not as someone who accepted that some lives mattered more than others. Not as someone who let fear turn her into a ghost. Footsteps echoed in the corridor again. Lyra did not stand this time. A figure appeared beyond the bars, but it was not Corvin. It was a woman. Older, maybe 50, dressed in the deep blue robes of the court physician. Her hair was silver, pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of stitching people back together, only to watch them tear themselves apart again. She carried a small leather bag. The guard unlocked the cell, and the physician stepped inside. The door clanged shut behind her. Lyra watched her warily. The physician set her bag down and knelt a few feet away, her movements slow and deliberate. "I am not here to harm you." "Then why are you here?" "To see if there is anything I can do to ease what you are feeling." Lyra laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You can tell your king that killing me will not make the bond go away. It will just make him live with a wound that never heals." The physician's expression did not change. "I know. Then why does he not?" The physician was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice quiet. "Because King Kalen believes survival is more important than wholeness, and he learned that belief from watching his parents die." Lyra's jaw tightened. "Corvin told me." "Did he tell you that I was there?" Lyra looked up sharply. The physician met her gaze. "I was the one who tried to save Queen Marin after the poison took hold. I spent 6 hours doing everything I knew to pull her back from the edge, and I failed. She died in the king's arms while her son watched from the doorway. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Old grief, old rage. And then I watched King Theron, the strongest alpha I have ever known, waste away over 3 months because the bond between them made living without her unthinkable. He did not eat, did not sleep, did not speak. He simply faded. And when he finally died, Kalen was the one who found him." Lyra's throat tightened. The physician continued. "So when I tell you that the king is afraid, I do not mean it as excuse. I mean it as explanation. He watched connection destroy the two people who were supposed to be invincible, and he decided that if he never allowed himself to connect, he would never be destroyed." "Then he should have stayed alone," Lyra said, her voice hard. "He should not have dragged me into this. The bond does not ask permission. No, it just punishes you for something you did not choose." The physician nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." Silence settled between them. Then the physician reached into her bag and pulled out a small vial. "This will not stop the pain, but it will dull it. Make the next few hours more bearable." Lyra stared at the vial. "Why?" "Because I have seen enough death, and I am tired of watching people destroy themselves because they are too afraid to survive differently." She set the vial on the ground between them and stood. "The guard will return in 10 minutes. Use it or do not. The choice is yours." She knocked on the cell door and the guard let her out. Lyra picked up the vial and turned it over in her hands. The liquid inside was clear, odorless. It could be poison. It could be mercy. She did not know which. But she uncorked it and drank it anyway. Because at this point, what difference did it make? The effect was immediate. The sharp edges of the bond's pain blunted, fading to a dull ache that was almost bearable. Her breathing eased, her heartbeat steadied. And in the relative quiet, she felt something else. Him. Not just presence, not just pain, conflict. Kaelin was at war with himself. She could feel it now, the way the bond carried echoes of what he was feeling even if it could not transmit thoughts. Fear. Yes, that was constant. But underneath it, something else. Longing. Not for her specifically, for what she represented. The possibility that he did not have to be alone. That connection did not have to end in destruction. That maybe, just maybe, the bond was not a trap, but a chance to survive differently than his parents had. Lyra closed her eyes and let herself feel it. And for the first time since the bond had formed, she understood something fundamental. He did not want to kill her. He wanted her to prove him wrong. Wanted her to show him that trust was not just another word for vulnerability waiting to be weaponized. Wanted her to survive what his parents could not. But he did not know how to ask for that. Did not know how to want something without it becoming a weakness someone else could exploit. So he had chosen the only option that felt like control. Elimination. Lyra opened her eyes. The cell was still dark. The walls were still damp. The execution was still coming. But something had shifted. She was not going to die quietly. She was not going to give him the easy out of believing he had no choice. If Kaelin Ardent Virion wanted her dead, he was going to have to look her in the eyes and admit that he was choosing fear over everything else. And she was going to make damn sure he never forgot it. Keek. Dawn came too fast and too slow. Kaelin had not moved from his chambers, had not slept, had barely breathed. The bond had been pulling at him all night, a constant pressure that demanded he go to her, that he stop this, that he choose differently. He had ignored it, had focused on the logic, the strategy, the cold calculation that had kept him alive for 15 years. A bonded alpha was a compromised alpha. A compromised alpha was a dead alpha. Therefore, the bond had to be severed before it became fatal. The math was simple. The execution was necessary. He repeated it like a mantra. It did not help. A knock at the door. "My king, it is time." Kaelin stood, his body moving on autopilot. He had dressed in full ceremonial armor, black and silver, the kind worn for state executions. A reminder that this was not personal. This was law. He stepped into the corridor. Thane was waiting, his expression unreadable. They walked in silence through the citadel, their footsteps echoing off marble walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of imperial rule, past tapestries depicting conquests and treaties, past windows that overlooked a city still sleeping under the pale light of early morning. The execution platform was in the central courtyard, visible from every tower. A demonstration, a warning. This is what happens when you disrupt imperial order. The court had already gathered, nobles in their finest, positioned by rank and house affiliation. Corvin stood at the front, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes. Satisfaction, vindication. This was what he had wanted all along, a king who remained unbonded, controllable, predictable. The headsman waited beside the block, his axe resting against his shoulder. He was hooded, anonymous, a tool of the state rather than a person. Kaelin took his position on the platform and forced himself to look composed, regal, in control. The bond was screaming now. He ignored it. Thane stepped forward. "Bring the prisoner." The guards appeared, dragging Lyra between them. She was not fighting. She walked with her head up, her eyes clear, her expression carved from something harder than stone. She looked directly at Kaelin, and he felt the bond lock tighter, felt the way her presence settled something inside him, even now, even here, even with an executioner's blade waiting to sever what had barely begun. The guards forced her to her knees in front of the block. Corvin stepped forward, a scroll in his hands. By order of King Kaelin Ardent Virion, Lyra Ashlyn of the Hollow District is hereby sentenced to death for disruption of imperial law, sedition against the crown, and sorcery intended to compromise the throne. Lyra's eyes never left Kaelin's face. Do you have any final words? Corvin asked. Yes. Her voice carried across the courtyard, clear and steady. She looked at Kaelin, and when she spoke, it was not to the court. It was to him. You think this makes you strong. You think executing me proves you cannot be manipulated. But all you are proving is that you are so afraid of being hurt that you would rather kill the one thing that could make you whole. The court murmured. Kaelin's expression did not change. Lyra continued. Your parents died because someone betrayed them. Not because they loved each other, not because they were bonded, because someone decided that their connection was a weapon and used it. And instead of learning that the problem was betrayal, you decided the problem was connection. Her voice was raw now, stripped of everything except truth. So go ahead, give the order. Prove that you are exactly what everyone says you are. A king who is so terrified of being human that he turned himself into something that cannot be touched, cannot be reached, cannot be anything except alone. Silence. Kaelin stared at her, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt the armor he had built around himself crack. Not because she was begging, because she was not. She was standing in front of an executioner's blade and using her last words to call him a coward. And she was right. He opened his mouth to give the order. Nothing came out. The bond pulled tighter, and suddenly he could feel everything she was feeling. The fear she was not showing, the anger, the grief for a life that was about to be stolen. The bone-deep exhaustion of surviving in a world that had never given her anything except reasons to quit. And underneath all of it, something else. Pity. Not for herself. For him. Because she understood that even if she died, he would be the one living with the wound. Kaelin's hands clenched at his sides. My king, Corvin prompted quietly. The order. Kaelin looked at the headsman. At the axe. At the court waiting for him to prove that he was still in control, and then he looked back at Lyra. She was not looking at him anymore. She had closed her eyes, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. And Kaelin realized something that made his chest feel like it was caving in. He could not do this, not because the bond would not let him, because he would not survive it, not the pain. He could endure pain, but the knowledge that he had become exactly what he swore he would never be. His father had been cruel when he needed to be, had executed traitors and enemies without hesitation, but he had never executed someone for the crime of making him feel. And if Kaelin gave this order, that was exactly what he would be doing, killing someone not because she was a threat to the Empire, but because she was a threat to the lie he had been telling himself for 15 years. That isolation was strength. That control was safety. That power without connection was power that could never be taken away. But standing here watching a woman kneel in front of a blade because he was too afraid to admit he needed her, Kaelin finally understood what Thane had been trying to tell him. He was not strong because he survived alone. He was just alone. And if he did not choose differently right now, he would stay that way until the day he died. The silence stretched. Corvin's smile began to falter. Kaelin took a breath and made a choice that would change everything. Stop. The single word cut through the courtyard like a blade. The headsman froze. The court erupted in whispers. Lyra's eyes snapped open. Kaelin descended from the platform slowly, each step deliberate. He walked to where Lyra knelt and stood in front of her, close enough that the bond settled into something almost bearable. Release her. The guards hesitated. I said release her. They stepped back. Lyra stared up at him, her expression unreadable. Kaelin reached down and offered his hand. For 3 seconds she did not move. Then she took it. He pulled her to her feet, and the moment their hands connected, the bond flooded with something neither of them had words for. Not relief. Recognition. That this was what it felt like when two people stopped fighting what they were and started fighting for it instead. Kaelin turned to face the court, Lyra's hand still in his. Corvin's smile had vanished completely. My king, what are you doing? What I should have done the moment the bond formed. Kaelin's voice was steady. I am choosing to trust it. My king, the law. The law was written by people who were afraid of what they could not control. And I am done letting fear make my decisions. He looked at Lyra. She was watching him with eyes that held no forgiveness, no gratitude, only a challenge. Prove it. And Kaelin realized that was exactly what he was going to have to do. Not with words, with every choice that came after this one. He turned back to the court. Lyra Ashlyn is under my protection. Anyone who harms her answers to me. Anyone who questions her place here questions the crown itself. The court was silent. Corvin stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. My king, I must advise. Your advice is noted and dismissed. Corvin's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Probably. But it is mine to make. Kaelin looked at Thane, who was watching with something that might have been approval. Clear the courtyard. The guards moved immediately, herding nobles and courtiers back toward the citadel. Within minutes, the platform was empty except for Kaelin, Lyra, Thane, and Corvin. Corvin stood very still, his hands folded, his expression a mask. This changes everything. Yes, it does. I cannot protect you if you insist on making yourself vulnerable. I am not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Kaelin met his advisor's eyes. I am telling you that if I discover you had anything to do with engineering this situation, if I find out that Lyra's sister was brought to the ceremony as part of some larger plan, you will not survive the revelation. Corvin's smile returned, thin and cold. My king, I have served this empire faithfully for you have served your own vision of what the empire should be, and I am done pretending they are the same thing. He gestured to Thane. Escort Corvin back to his quarters. He is confined there until I decide otherwise. Corvin did not resist as guards appeared to flank him, but as he was led away, he looked back once, and the expression on his face promised that this was not over. When they were alone, Lyra pulled her hand free from Kaelin's. Do not mistake this for gratitude, she said quietly. I do not. You could have stopped this before I was dragged into a cell, before I spent a night thinking I was going to die. I know, you could have chosen differently from the beginning. Yes, so why did you not? Because I was afraid, and fear is a convincing liar. Lyra studied him. What changed? Kaelin looked at her, and for the first time in 15 years allowed himself to be honest. You did. You stood in front of an executioner and used your last words to tell me I was a coward. And you were right. That does not fix what you put me through. No, it does not. So what happens now? Kaelin did not have an answer, because the truth was, he had just made a decision that went against every instinct he had spent a lifetime cultivating. He had chosen connection over control, trust over certainty. A bond he could not predict over an empire he had built to be predictable. And he had absolutely no idea if he would survive it. But standing here, feeling the bond settle into something that felt less like a chain and more like a foundation, he realized something. He did not want to survive it alone anymore. Now, he said quietly, we figure out if I am strong enough to be wrong about everything I thought kept me safe. Lyra held his gaze. And if you are not, then at least I will know I tried to be something other than afraid. It was not a promise. It was not a vow. It was just the truth. And as the sun rose over Virolith Citadel, painting the courtyard in shades of gold and shadow, two people stood in the space between what they had been and what they might become. Neither of them knew if they would survive it, but for the first time they were willing to find out, together. And in the tower above, watching from a window he had planned to use for something else entirely, Corvin Drell smiled, because chaos was just another word for opportunity. And opportunity was something he had always known how to use. The decision to spare Lyra should have been the end of one story and the beginning of another. It was neither. It was the moment when every carefully laid plan Corvin Drell had spent 3 years building began to accelerate toward a conclusion that would leave no one unchanged. Kaelin had made his choice in front of the entire court. He had rejected the principle that had defined his reign. He had chosen connection over control, and in doing so, he had handed his enemies the one weapon they needed, proof that the king could be compromised. The court did not erupt immediately. That was not how power collapsed in Virolith. It happened quietly, behind closed doors in conversations that sounded like concern but tasted like conspiracy. Within hours of the failed execution, the machinery of imperial politics began to turn in directions Kaelin could not see, but Corvin had orchestrated with surgical precision. Because Corvin Drell was not a man who planned for one outcome. He planned for all of them. And the moment Kaelin chose to spare Lyra, Corvin activated the contingency that would destroy them both. Kaelin did not know this yet. He was too focused on trying to understand what he had just done. In the private study adjacent to his chambers, He stood at the window and watched the city wake beneath a sky that looked too peaceful for what had just happened. Lyra sat across the room, her arms wrapped around herself, still wearing the clothes she had been dragged to an execution in. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the courtyard. The bond had settled into something that felt less like agony and more like presence, constant, undeniable. A weight that reminded him with every breath that he was no longer alone in his own awareness. It should have felt like relief. It felt like exposure. Every thought felt louder. Every emotion felt sharper. The bond did not read his mind, but it carried echoes of what he felt, and he could sense hers in return. Fear, anger, exhaustion, and underneath it all, a wariness that felt like standing on ice that might crack at any moment. Kaelin had spent 15 years making sure no one could read him. Now someone could feel him without trying. It was suffocating. Lyra broke the silence first. How long before they try to kill you? Kaelin did not turn from the window. They have been trying to kill me since I took the throne. This changes nothing. It changes everything. You just proved that you can be influenced, that you will abandon principle for personal attachment. Every enemy you have will use that against you. I know. Then why did you do it? Kaelin finally turned to face her. Because the alternative was becoming something I could not survive being. That is not an answer. Yes, it is. Lyra stood and the movement was sharp, angry. You do not get to act like this was some noble sacrifice. You put me in a cell. You ordered my execution. You made me believe I was going to die because you were too afraid to feel something. And now you want credit for changing your mind at the last possible second? No. Then what do you want? Kaelin's jaw tightened. I want you to understand that I am trying, that I do not know how to do this, that every instinct I have is screaming at me to lock you somewhere I can control the variables because that is the only way I know how to keep anything safe. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes hard. I am not something you keep safe. I am not a possession. I am not a problem you solve by controlling the environment around me. I know that. Do you? Because from where I am standing, it looks like you saved me so you could own the bond instead of destroy it. The words hit harder than she probably intended, because there was truth in them. Kaelin had spent 15 years learning that ownership was the only form of safety that lasted. If you controlled something completely, it could not betray you. If you held every variable, you could not be surprised. But the bond did not work that way. It demanded equality, demanded vulnerability, demanded that he trust someone with access to parts of himself he had spent a lifetime sealing away. And he did not know how to do that without it feeling like handing someone a blade and hoping they chose not to use it. This is what alphas feared more than death. Not the loss of power, but the loss of control over their own instincts. The bond rewrote autonomy at the genetic level. It turned independence into interdependence whether you wanted it or not. And for someone who had built an empire on the principle that self-sufficiency was survival, the bond was not a gift. It was an invasion. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Kaelin said quietly. I'm asking you to give me time to learn how to be something other than what I was. And if you cannot, then I will have failed. But I would rather fail trying than succeed at staying alone. Lyra held his gaze for a long moment. Then she sat back down, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. I do not trust you. I do not expect you to. But I am not leaving. Why not? Because the bond will not let me. And because someone needs to make sure you do not turn yourself back into a tyrant the moment things get difficult. Kaelin almost smiled. It did not reach his eyes. That is not reassuring. It was not meant to be. Silence settled again, heavier this time, weighted with everything they were not saying. The bond pulled between them like a rope stretched too tight, carrying the texture of emotions neither wanted to name. Resentment, hope, fear that hoping was just another form of setting yourself up for destruction. A knock at the door shattered it. Enter. Thane stepped inside, and his expression was carved from stone. My king, we have a problem. Kaelin's body went rigid. Speak. 3 houses have formally requested an emergency session of the High Council. Volterra, Meren, and Kess. They are invoking the protocols of Imperial Review. Lyra looked between them. What does that mean? It means they are questioning whether the king is fit to rule, Thane said bluntly. It is a legal mechanism designed to prevent a monarch from making decisions that destabilize the empire. If the council votes in majority, they can force the king to abdicate or submit to a regency. Kaelin's hands curled into fists. Who is leading this? Thane hesitated. Officially, Lady Cerys of House Valterra. Unofficially, the whole thing has Corvin's fingerprints all over it. Of course it does. Lyra stood. Can they actually remove you? Not easily, but they can make it impossible to govern. They can fracture the Empire into civil war if they push hard enough. Kaelin looked at Thane. When is the session? Tomorrow at dawn. That is too fast. They would have needed to plan this weeks in advance. Exactly. Thane's voice was grim. This was always the plan. Corvin was waiting for you to show weakness, and you gave it to him. Kaelin felt something cold settle in his chest. Corvin had not been surprised by the bond. He had been prepared for it. The entire ceremony, Lyra being dragged into the hall, Lyra's arrest. The execution scheduled so quickly there was no time to think. All of it had been designed to force Kaelin into a corner where any choice he made would be used against him. If he had executed Lyra, he would have proven he could not be bonded and therefore was incomplete as an alpha. The old text said a king who rejected his true mate was a king who rejected his own completion. The court would have questioned his legitimacy. If he spared her, he proved he could be manipulated through emotional attachment. The council would call him compromised. Either way, Corvin won. This was the sophistication of true political manipulation. Not forcing someone into one bad choice, but engineering a situation where every possible choice led to the same outcome. Checkmate delivered 3 moves before you realized you were playing. Lyra seemed to understand at the same moment. He set this up. All of it. Yes, my sister was bait. Thane's voice was not unkind. I am sorry, but Corvin has been orchestrating this for longer than any of us realized. Lyra's face went pale, then hard. Where is she? Safe, Thane said quickly. I have her under guard in the East Wing. Corvin never intended to hurt her. He just needed her to be the reason you walked into that hall. Lyra looked at Kaelin. You knew. Not at first, but I should have seen it sooner. Why did you not? Because I wanted to believe that the worst thing I was dealing with was my own fear, not someone else's ambition. The room fell silent. Then Lyra spoke, her voice low and dangerous. What are you going to do? Kaelin met her eyes. I am going to fight, and I am going to win. Because if I do not, everything I just chose will be used to justify removing me and installing someone Corvin can control. And if you lose, then the bond will not matter because we will both be dead or exiled, and the Empire will tear itself apart. Lyra's jaw tightened. Then we do not lose. Kaelin felt something shift in his chest. Not the bond. Something else. Recognition that she was not asking to be protected. She was offering to fight beside him. And that was more terrifying than any execution because it meant trusting her with more than his life. It meant trusting her with his throne. He had been taught that ruling meant standing alone at the top of a pyramid, making decisions no one else could make, bearing weight no one else could carry. His father had ruled that way. Every king before him had ruled that way. The throne was designed for one person because power diluted when shared. But standing here, feeling the bond hum with Lyra's determination, Kaelin wondered if that teaching had been wrong all along. If isolation at the top was not strength, but structural weakness. A single point of failure that men like Corvin had learned to exploit with precision. But the High Council convened in the Hall of Succession, a circular chamber built from white stone and lit by windows that turned morning light into something that felt like judgment. 12 seats arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by the head of a major house or the representative of a key imperial institution. Kaelin entered alone. It was a calculated choice. Bringing guards would look like fear. Bringing advisors would look like he needed others to speak for him. He wore the full regalia of his office, crown and all, a reminder that he was not here as a defendant. He was here as their king. The council rose as he entered. Protocol, respect. But the expressions on their faces ranged from concern to barely concealed hostility. Lady Cerys of House Valterra sat at the center, her posture perfect, her face a mask of reasonable authority. Beside her, Lord Taryn of House Muren and Lady Cassida of House Kess. All 3 had been rejected during the selection ceremony. All three had reason to want him gone. Corvin sat in the advisor's seat, positioned slightly behind and to the left of the council. He was not a voting member, but his presence was a reminder of who held real influence in this room. Kaelin took the accused seat at the center of the semicircle. It felt like standing in the middle of a firing squad. Lady Saris spoke first, her voice clear and measured. King Kaelin Ardent Virion, you have been summoned before this council to address concerns regarding your recent actions and their impact on imperial stability. State your concerns. 3 days ago, you arrested a common servant for disrupting imperial law. Yesterday, you ordered her execution. This morning, you reversed that order in full view of the court and declared her under your protection. These actions are erratic, contradictory, and suggest impaired judgment, or they suggest I learned new information and changed my position accordingly. What information? That the bond between us is real. That executing her would serve no purpose except proving I am willing to destroy something valuable out of fear. Lord Terran leaned forward. You admit, then, that your decision was based on personal attachment rather than imperial law. I admit that my decision was based on recognizing that the law I was about to enforce was wrong. The law is not wrong simply because it inconveniences you. The law that demands I remain unbonded was written by people who believed connection makes a ruler weak. I no longer believe that. Lady Cassida's voice was sharp. What you believe is irrelevant. The question is whether the Empire can afford a king who changes foundational policy based on personal feelings. The question is whether the Empire can afford a king who refuses to evolve when presented with evidence that his assumptions were flawed. Corvin spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as oil. My king, no one questions your right to evolve. But evolution requires stability. What the Council is concerned about is whether your recent actions demonstrate evolution or vulnerability to manipulation. I was not manipulated. Were you not? Corvin stood, moving to the center of the room. A servant girl disrupts your ceremony. You arrest her. A bond forms. You reverse your decision. From an outside perspective, it appears that you were forced into a choice by a force you cannot control. The bond does not control me. Then why did you spare her? Because it was the right thing to do, or because the bond made it painful not to? Kaelin's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. The bond is not a leash. It is a connection that allows me to sense what I could not sense before. And what I sensed was that executing someone for speaking truth was the act of a tyrant, not a king. Lady Saris raised her hand, silencing Corvin. King Kaelin, we are not here to debate the morality of your decision. We are here to assess whether you remain capable of leading this empire. And the concern is simple. You have demonstrated that your judgment can be altered by emotional attachment. That makes you vulnerable. And a vulnerable king is a liability. Then every king who has ever been bonded is a liability. Yes. Which is why the strongest rulers in our history remained unbonded until the empire was secure enough to withstand their compromise. Kaelin looked around the room, every face watching him with varying degrees of suspicion and calculation. And he realized something that made his chest feel hollow. This was not about the bond. This was about power. They did not care whether he was compromised. They cared that he had made a decision without consulting them first, that he had acted independently, that he had proven he would prioritize something other than their approval, and that made him dangerous to the system they had built around him. The empire was not a monolith. It was a web of competing interests held together by the fiction that the king stood above them all. But the moment a king proved he had interests of his own, interests that might conflict with the careful balance of power the houses had negotiated, he became the enemy, not of the empire, of the people who profited from its current structure. You want me to abdicate? Kaelin said quietly. The room went still. Lady Saris's expression did not change. We want you to recognize that the empire requires stability. If that means submitting to a council of regency until the bond can be properly assessed. No. Kaelin stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, and every eye in the room tracked it. I will not abdicate. I will not submit to regency. And I will not allow this council to pretend that what you are doing is for the good of the empire when it is clearly about consolidating power in the hands of people I have spent 3 years refusing to let control me. Lord Terran's voice was cold. You are accusing this council of treason. I am stating a fact. You're using the bond as an excuse to remove a king who will not be controlled, and you are doing it under the guidance of a man who has been orchestrating this outcome since the moment I took the throne." Kaelin turned to Corvin. Their eyes met, and Corvin smiled. Not the polite smile of an advisor, the satisfied smile of a man whose plan had just reached its apex. "My king," Corvin said softly, "you give me far too much credit. Do I? Let us review." Lyra Ashlyn was brought to the ceremony against protocol. Her sister happened to be watching from the service corridor. The bond happened to form at the exact moment that would cause maximum disruption, and this council happened to have documents prepared for an imperial review within hours of the event. Corvin spread his hands. Coincidence. There's no such thing as coincidence in imperial politics. There is only planning. Then prove it. Kaelin stared at him, because that was the trap. He could not prove it. Not without evidence that Corvin had been too careful to leave. And without proof, any accusation was just paranoia from a king trying to deflect legitimate questions about his fitness to rule. Corvin had built the perfect snare, and Kaelin had walked into it the moment he chose to trust the bond over his instincts. Lady Saris stood. "King Kaelin, this council will deliberate on whether to invoke Article 17 of the Imperial Charter, which allows for temporary suspension of royal authority pending review. You will be notified of our decision by evening. I will not accept it. You do not have a choice. The Charter is law. Then change the law. We cannot change what you yourself established." And there it was, the final twist of the blade. 15 years ago, when Kaelin had taken the throne in the aftermath of his parents' deaths, he had written the Imperial Charter to prevent exactly the kind of chaos that had nearly destroyed the Empire. He had built in mechanisms to check royal power, to prevent a king from becoming a tyrant, to ensure that no single person could drag the Empire into disaster through unchecked authority. He had designed the system that was now being used to remove him, and he had no one to blame but himself. This was the cost of building safeguards. They worked equally well in the hands of people who wanted to protect the Empire and people who wanted to control it. Kaelin had assumed good faith, had believed that the mechanisms he created would only be used when genuinely necessary. He had not accounted for Corvin, had not imagined that someone would spend years positioning pieces on a board so that when the moment came, every rule Kaelin had written would become a weapon pointed at his throat. Corvin's smile widened. Kaelin felt the bond pull tight as Lyra, somewhere in the Citadel, sensed his distress, and he understood with brutal clarity what Corvin had known all along. The bond was not the weakness. Trust was. The moment Kaelin had chosen to trust that connection could be something other than a weapon, he had given Corvin exactly what he needed to destroy him. Not evidence, proof of humanity. And in an empire built on the principle that power required being something more than human, humanity was the most damning evidence of all. Lady Cassida spoke, her voice almost gentle. "My king, no one is questioning your strength. We are questioning whether that strength has been compromised in ways that make you unable to lead effectively. The bond is not your fault, but it is a reality, and realities must be managed." "Managed," Kaelin repeated. "You mean controlled. We mean assessed. If the bond proves to be stable, if you prove that you can govern without being influenced by it, then perhaps in time what? I earn back the right to rule the empire I rebuilt from collapse? I prove to you that I am still useful?" Lord Terran's jaw tightened. "You are twisting our words." "No. I am clarifying them. You want me to submit to oversight because you believe I can no longer be trusted to make decisions alone. But the truth is, you never trusted me. You tolerated me because I was useful, because an unbonded king who refused every alliance was a king who could not build a power base that threatened yours." He looked at each of them in turn. "But the moment I chose something for myself, the moment I prioritized my own judgment over your approval, I became the enemy. Not because I failed the empire, because I stopped serving you." The silence was absolute. Then Corvin spoke, and his voice was soft, almost kind. "My king, you are fatigued, emotional. Perhaps if you took time to reflect." "I am not fatigued. I am awake. For the first time in 3 years, I am seeing this council for what it is. Not a check on my power, a leash." Lady Saris's expression hardened. "You go too far." "Do I?" Then answer me this. If I were to submit to regency, who would you appoint? Someone loyal to me? Or someone loyal to Corvin? We would appoint someone loyal to the Empire, which is not an answer. No one spoke. Kalen felt something inside him shift, not breaking, crystallizing, the understanding that he had been playing a game where the rules were designed to ensure he lost, and the only way to survive was to stop playing. He looked at Corvin. You want me to prove I am not compromised? Very well. I will prove it. How? By showing you that I am willing to do what my father could not, survive the bond and use it to strengthen the Empire rather than weaken it. Pretty words, Corvin said, but words are not proof. Then watch what I do next. Kalen turned and walked toward the door. My king, you have not been dismissed, Lady Sarah said sharply. Kalen stopped, his hand on the door. I do not need your permission to leave. I am still king, and until you vote to remove me, I will govern as I see fit. He left the Hall of Succession without looking back. The door closed behind him with the sound of a line being drawn. Shaik. The council dismissed shortly after, but Corvin remained. He stood alone in the circular chamber, reviewing documents that would formalize Kalen's suspension, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Better, even. Kalen had refused to submit, had walked out of the council chamber like a man who still believed he had options. And that was perfect, because a king who refused to accept the council's authority was a king who could be framed as a tyrant in the making. And tyrants, even effective ones, could be removed by force if necessary. Corvin had spent 3 years positioning the pieces, 3 years guiding Kalen toward isolation, 3 years ensuring that when the moment came, the king would have no allies strong enough to resist the council's judgment. He had anticipated every outcome, except one. The door opened. Corvin looked up, expecting a council member returning for further discussion. It was not. Lyra Ashlyn walked into the Hall of Succession, flanked by 2 guards. Not prisoners. Escorts. Corvin's expression did not change, but something inside him went still. Miss Ashlyn, he said smoothly, you should not be here. This is a closed session. The session is over, and I have every right to be here. On what grounds? On the grounds that I am bonded to the king, which makes me Luna in all but title. And Luna has the right to address the council. Corvin's smile thinned. That right has not been formally recognized. Then recognize it now. I am not the council. No. You are the man who engineered everything that happened in the throne hall, and I am here to tell you that I know. Corvin studied her. Interesting theory. Do you have proof? Not yet. But I will. Then this conversation is pointless. Lyra stepped closer. You think you have won. You think Kalen is cornered, but you made one mistake. And what is that? You assumed he would keep fighting alone. Corvin's expression flickered. Just for a moment. Then the smile returned. Miss Ashlyn, you are welcome to believe whatever comforts you, but the reality is simple. The king is compromised. The council will act. And there is nothing you or he can do to stop it. We will see. Lyra turned and walked out, leaving Corvin standing in the empty chamber. He waited until her footsteps faded. Then he allowed his smile to drop. Because she was right about one thing. He had not planned for Kalen to have an ally who understood the game well enough to play it, and that was a variable he would need to eliminate. Quickly. Kalen found Lyra in the corridor outside his chambers. She was leaning against the wall, her arms crossed, her expression hard. I went to the council hall, she said without preamble. Why? To let Corvin know we are not going to roll over. That was reckless. Probably. But necessary. Kalen studied her. What did you say to him? That I know what he did. That we are going to prove it. Can we? Lyra met his eyes. I do not know. But he does not know that we cannot. And uncertainty is the only weapon we have right now. Kalen felt something shift in his chest. Not the bond. Something else. Respect. Recognition that she understood the game being played better than he had given her credit for. The council will vote to suspend me by evening, he said quietly. When they do, Corvin will move to install a regency, probably led by someone he controls. And once that happens, removing me permanently will be a matter of paperwork. Then we move first. Move how? Lyra straightened. You said the bond makes you vulnerable, but it also makes you something Corvin did not plan for. It makes you unpredictable. So stop trying to fight him using the rules he wrote. Start using the one advantage he cannot control, which is me. Kaelin stared at her and understood. Corvin had planned for a king who stood alone, who made decisions in isolation, who could be maneuvered into corners because he had no one to share the weight with. But Lyra changed that equation. She was not part of the system Corvin had spent years manipulating. She had no house, no allegiance, no political position that could be leveraged. She was chaos in a game built on predictability. And chaos, properly directed, was the only thing that could break a perfect trap. Kaelin looked at her. If we do this, there is no going back. If we fight Corvin the way you are suggesting, we will be declaring war on the council itself, on the structure of power that holds this empire together. Maybe that structure needs to break. And what do we build in its place? Something better. Or nothing. But at least we will have tried. Kaelin felt the bond hum between them. Not demanding, not controlling, just present, a reminder that for the first time in 15 years, he was not making this choice alone. He took a breath and made a decision that would reshape everything. Not to surrender, not to fight using the rules they expected, but to burn the game board down and build something new from the ashes, even if it cost him everything he had spent his life protecting, because some things were worth more than empires. And trust, he was beginning to understand, was one of them. The decision to burn down the game board was easier than executing it. Kaelin stood in the war room deep within the Citadel, a chamber built during the First Conquest when strategy meant the difference between empire and extinction. Maps covered every wall, troop movements, supply lines, trade routes, the physical architecture of power rendered in ink and parchment. But the war he was about to fight would not be won with armies. It would be won with truth, or lost with it. Thane stood across from him, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. You're asking me to arrest half the council. I'm asking you to arrest traitors. The council will call it a coup. Let them. By the time they understand what is happening, it will be too late. Lyra leaned against the table, her eyes scanning the names Kaelin had written. Theris, Terran, Cassida, and above them all, Corvin Drell. You need proof before you move. Without it, this is just a king eliminating political opposition. We have proof. Kaelin gestured to a stack of documents Thane had spent the last 6 hours compiling. Financial records showing payments from Corvin to operatives in the Hollow District. Testimony from guards who were ordered to bring Lyra to the ceremony without official sanction. Communications between Corvin and the 3 houses now leading the Imperial Review. It was not enough to convict in a court, but it was enough to raise questions. And in politics, questions were weapons. This will start a war, Thane said quietly. The houses loyal to the council will see this as tyranny. They will mobilize. And we do not have the forces to fight them all. Then we do not fight them all. We cut off the head and let the body collapse. Kaelin looked at Lyra. She was watching him with an expression he could not read. Not fear, not approval. Something else. Recognition that they were crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. You understand what this means, he said. If we do this, I am proving exactly what Corvin has been saying, that I am compromised, that I will destroy the Empire to protect what I want. No. Lyra stepped forward. You are proving that you will destroy corruption to protect what the Empire should be. There is a difference. The Council will not see it that way. The Council is not the Empire. The people are. And the people know what it looks like when someone in power sacrifices everything to do what is right instead of what is safe. Kaelin felt the bond pull tighter, carrying the weight of her conviction. She believed what she was saying, believed it with the kind of certainty that came from living on the underside of power and seeing exactly how it operated when no one was watching. But belief did not stop blades, did not prevent civil war, did not guarantee that burning down a corrupt system would leave anything worth rebuilding. This is what separated those who ruled from those who survived. Rulers had to calculate costs in lives and futures, and the abstract weight of stability. Survivors only had to calculate whether the next choice would kill them. Kaelin had spent 15 years being a ruler, and now he was about to become something else. Someone willing to risk the empire itself on the possibility that truth mattered more than order. Thane broke the silence. When do we move? Tonight, before the council votes, before Corvin can consolidate his position. He will be expecting something. Yes, but not this. He thinks I will fight legally, challenge the review through proper channels, exhaust every option before resorting to force, and instead we arrest him for treason and let the evidence speak for itself. Thane studied him for a long moment, and if the evidence is not enough, then I will have committed treason to stop treason, and history will judge which was worse. Thane nodded slowly. Then he straightened. I will gather the loyalists, 50 men, enough to secure the council hall and Corvin's quarters without alerting the entire citadel. Make it 100. I want overwhelming force, no room for resistance. Thane left without another word. The door closed. Kaelin turned to Lyra. You should not be here when this happens. Where should I be? Somewhere safe. Somewhere Corvin cannot use you as leverage. I am not hiding. This is not about hiding. This is about control, Lyra finished. You are still trying to control the variables, still trying to make sure nothing can hurt you, because things that hurt me hurt you now. That is what the bond means. No. The bond means we survive together or not at all. And I am not letting you walk into a fight alone just because you think protecting me is the same thing as protecting yourself. Kaelin stared at her and realized she was right. He was still operating from the same playbook, still trying to isolate the threat and handle it alone because that was the only way he knew how to keep anything safe. But the bond did not allow for that. It demanded shared risk, shared consequence, shared trust that the other person would not break under pressure. And trust, Kaelin was learning, was the hardest discipline he had ever tried to master. You stay close to Thane, he said finally. You do not engage unless there is no other option. And if things collapse, you run. Lyra's jaw tightened. That is not negotiable. If I fall, you survive. Because someone needs to make sure the Empire knows what Corvin did, and who will believe a servant over an advisor? They will, if you are Luna. Kaelin pulled a ring from his hand, heavy silver engraved with the Virion crest. He held it out to her. This marks you as bonded to the crown. It gives you the right to speak before the council, to testify, to be heard. Lyra looked at the ring like it was a weapon. I did not ask for this. I know, but I'm asking you to take it anyway. She met his eyes. And if I refuse? Then you refuse, but you will still be bonded, still be a target. The only difference is whether you have the authority to fight back. Lyra took the ring slowly. It was too large for her finger. She slid it onto her thumb where it sat like a brand. This does not make me yours. I know. It does not mean I forgive you. I know that too. Then why give it to me? Because you are the only person in this empire I trust to tell the truth, even when it costs you everything. Lyra held his gaze, and then for the first time since the bond had formed, something shifted in her expression. Not softening, not acceptance, but recognition that he meant what he said. Do not die tonight, she said quietly. I will do my best. That is not good enough. It is all I have. The bond hummed between them, carrying the texture of fear neither wanted to name. Not fear of death, fear of what death would do to the other, fear that connection had already become the weakness everyone warned them about. But there was no time to untangle it. Thane returned with 100 men in black armor, faces hidden, weapons ready. They moved like shadows through the corridors, silent and efficient. These were not the ceremonial guards who stood at doors. These were the soldiers who had fought beside Kaelin during the Civil War, who had bled for the Empire when it was just an idea held together by force and desperation. They did not question the order. They simply obeyed. Kaelin addressed them in the courtyard beneath a sky turning the color of bruised iron. Tonight we move against a threat that has been operating inside the Citadel for years. Corvin Drell has engineered a coup disguised as legal process. He has manipulated the council. He has weaponized imperial law against the throne itself. And tonight we end it. He paused, letting the words settle. Some of you will question whether this is justice or tyranny, whether arresting the king's advisor is protection or paranoia. I do not have an answer that will satisfy everyone. I only have this. I would rather risk being wrong about Corvin and face the consequences than allow him to destroy everything we rebuilt because I was too afraid to act. The soldiers did not cheer, did not respond. They simply readied their weapons. That was answer enough. Kalen turned to Thane. Split into 3 groups. One secures Corvin's quarters. One secures the council hall. One holds the main entrance to prevent anyone from leaving. No one dies unless there is no other option. This is an arrest, not an execution. Understood. The soldiers dispersed into the night like water finding cracks in stone. Kalen watched them go and felt the weight of what he had just set in motion. This was the moment that separated kings from tyrants, the moment when force was used not to suppress opposition, but to prevent destruction. The line was thin, almost invisible, and history was littered with rulers who believed they were on the right side of it, only to discover too late that good intentions did not prevent atrocities. But standing here, feeling the bond pull tight with Lara's presence beside him, Kalen understood something his father never had. Power was not the ability to act without consequence. It was the willingness to accept consequence and act anyway. Corvin Drell was in his private study when the soldiers came. He had been expecting something, just not this. Not 100 armed men smashing through doors, not Commander Thane standing in the wreckage with an expression that promised violence if Corvin so much as breathed wrong. Corvin Drell, Thane said, his voice flat. You are under arrest for treason, conspiracy against the crown, and manipulation of imperial law. Corvin stood slowly from behind his desk. His hands were steady, his expression calm. On what evidence? Thane gestured. 2 soldiers stepped forward carrying the documents Kalen had compiled. Financial records, testimonies, communications. Corvin glanced at them without concern. Fabrications. We will let the council decide that. The council answers to me. Not anymore. Soldiers moved to seize him, but Corvin raised one hand. Wait. Thane did not stop them, but they hesitated. Corvin smiled. Commander, you are making a mistake. The king is compromised. The bond has altered his judgment. By arresting me, you are proving that he is willing to eliminate anyone who questions his authority. The king is eliminating a traitor who served this empire faithfully for 3 years while the king refused every alliance, rejected every partnership, and turned himself into a tyrant too afraid to trust anyone. Thane's expression did not change. Save it for the council. The council will condemn him for this. And when they do, you will have to choose. Loyalty to a fallen king or loyalty to the empire. I chose the empire the day I swore my oath, and the empire is not you. Corvin's smile widened. We will see. The soldier seized him, pulling his arms behind his back and binding his wrists. He did not resist, did not struggle. He walked between them with the calm of a man who had planned for this exact scenario and knew it was not the end, just the next move. They dragged him through corridors that were waking to the sound of conflict. Nobles emerging from their chambers, guards demanding answers, chaos spreading like fire as word of the arrest reached every corner of the citadel. By the time they reached the council hall, half the court had gathered, and they were angry. Lady Sarah stood at the front, flanked by Taryn and Cassida. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. What is the meaning of this? Thane did not flinch. Corvin Drell is under arrest for treason. On whose authority? The king's. The king does not have the authority to arrest a member of the council without due process. The king has the authority to protect the empire from threats, internal or otherwise. This is not protection, this is tyranny. The crowd erupted, voices overlapping, some demanding answers, some calling for Kalen's removal, some trying to restore order that had already collapsed. And through it all, Corvin stood silent, his expression serene, as if he were watching a play unfold exactly as he had written it. Because he had. This was the contingency. If Kalen moved against him, it would prove to the council that the king was unstable, that the bond had compromised his judgment, that he was willing to use force to eliminate political opposition. Everything Corvin had warned them about, proof delivered by Kalen's own hand. Thane pushed through the crowd toward the center of the hall where the council seats waited. He forced Corvin into the accused position and turned to address the gathered nobles. Before this council and the empire, I present evidence of treason committed by Corvin Drell, manipulation of ceremony, payments to operatives, communications designed to destabilize the throne. He laid the documents on the table. No one moved to look at them, because they did not care about evidence. They cared about power. And power, in this moment, was defined by who controlled the narrative. Lady Sarah stepped forward. "Commander Thane, you overstep your authority. This council has not authorized an arrest. This council has not reviewed evidence. This is a military action against a civilian advisor with no legal foundation. The foundation is treason, which you have not proven." Thane's jaw tightened. "Then review the documents." "We will." After the king explains why he ordered this arrest without consulting the body designed to check his authority. She turned to the entrance, and Kaelin stepped through. The hall went silent. He wore full armor, black and silver, designed for war, not ceremony. The crown was absent. In its place, just the hard angles of his face and eyes that promised he was done pretending this was anything other than what it was. A fight. Kaelin walked to the center of the hall and stood beside Thane. He looked at the council, at the nobles, at Corvin, who was watching him with that same satisfied smile. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of 15 years of survival. Corvin Drell orchestrated the disruption of the selection ceremony. He arranged for Lyra Ashland to be brought before the court as bait. He anticipated the bond and prepared to weaponize it regardless of the outcome. He has spent 3 years positioning himself as indispensable while ensuring that I remained isolated and controllable. He gestured to the documents. "The evidence is there. Review it or do not. But understand this. I will not allow this empire to be controlled by a man who sees the throne as a tool and the king as a puppet." Lady Saris's voice was cold. "You speak of control while arresting a counselor without due process. You speak of protection while deploying soldiers against civilians. You have become what you claim to fight. No, I have stopped pretending that order matters more than truth." The hall erupted again. Kaelin let it. Let the voices clash and overlap. Let the chaos he had unleashed play out. Because chaos was honest. Chaos did not hide behind procedure and decorum. It laid bare exactly what people cared about. And what Kaelin saw in the faces around him was not concern for the empire. It was fear of losing control. These were people who had built power on the foundation of a king who refused to bond, who remained predictable, who could be influenced through the careful application of pressure disguised as advice. And now that King was bonded, unpredictable, willing to burn down systems they had spent years building, they were not afraid he was compromised. They were afraid he was free. This is the test that every generation of power faces. Not whether they can maintain order, whether they can survive change, whether they can recognize when the structures they built to protect themselves have become prisons for everyone else. Kaelin had built the imperial charter to prevent tyranny, but he had not accounted for the possibility that tyranny could operate through law itself, that rules designed to protect could become weapons when wielded by people who valued control over justice. Corvin spoke for the first time since entering the hall. "My king, you are afraid. Afraid that the bond has weakened you, afraid that the council sees what you will not admit, that you are no longer fit to rule." Kaelin turned to him. "I am afraid, but not of weakness. I'm afraid that if I do not stop you now, this empire will become exactly what my parents died fighting against. A machine that grinds people into nothing and calls it stability. Then you admit you are acting out of fear rather than reason. I am acting out of the understanding that reason without conscience is just cruelty in a tailored suit." Corvin's smile did not falter. Pretty words. But the council is not moved by poetry. They are moved by proof. And you have none. Kaelin felt the bond pull tight and realized something. Corvin was right. The documents were not enough. Testimony from servants and soldiers would be dismissed as coercion. Financial records could be explained as legitimate expenditures. Everything Kaelin had compiled could be reframed, recontextualized, made to look like paranoia from a king desperate to justify his actions. Corvin had built his trap too well. There was only one way to break it. Lyra stepped forward from where she had been standing behind Thane. The hall went silent. She walked to the center and stopped beside Kaelin. The ring on her thumb caught the light. Heavy silver. Unmistakable. The mark of Luna. Lady Cassida's voice was sharp. "The bonded has no right to address this council." "Yes, she does," Kaelin said. Article 9 of the Imperial Charter grants the bonded mate of the sovereign the right to testify in matters of succession and treason. That article has never been invoked. Until now. Lyra looked at Corvin, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. You came to my cell the night before my execution. You told me that my death was not personal, that it was policy. You told me that Kaelin's parents were bonded, that his mother was assassinated, that his father died of grief. Corvin's expression did not change. I told you history. No. You told me strategy. You explained exactly how you planned to use my death to break him. You said that a king who remained unbonded was a king who could not be manipulated through emotional leverage, that you had spent years cultivating that stability. I said no such thing. You did, and you said it because you believed I would not survive to repeat it. The hall murmured. Corvin turned to the council. She is lying. A desperate attempt to save her king by fabricating testimony. Lyra did not flinch. Then explain why you were in the dungeons at all. Explain why the king's advisor felt it necessary to visit a prisoner hours before her execution, unless it was to ensure that the outcome you had orchestrated proceeded as planned. Corvin opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time since the arrest, his composure cracked. Just for a second. But it was enough. Lady Saris looked between them. Is this true? Corvin straightened. I visited the prisoner to assess her mental state. The king's decision to arrest her was erratic. I wanted to ensure she was not a threat, by telling her she was going to die as policy, by explaining the reality of her situation, that reality being that you wanted her dead to maintain control over the king. Corvin's voice hardened. That is not what I said. Then what did you say? The silence stretched, and in that silence the truth became visible, not because Corvin admitted it, but because he could not deny it without lying in a way that would be obvious to everyone watching. He had been too confident, too certain that Lyra would not survive, too willing to reveal his strategy because dead witnesses told no tales. And now that witness was standing in front of the Empire with the authority to speak and the will to use it. Lady Saris looked at the documents on the table, then at Corvin, then at Kaelin. This council will review the evidence, she said finally. Corvin Drell will remain in custody pending investigation. The vote on Imperial review is suspended until the matter is resolved. It was not exoneration, but it was not condemnation either. It was the thing Kaelin had needed most. Time. Corvin was led away by soldiers, his expression carved from stone. But as he passed Kaelin, he leaned close enough that only the king could hear. This is not over. No, it is not. You think you have won, but all you have done is prove that you are willing to destroy the Empire to protect one person, and that will be your downfall, or my salvation. Corvin smiled. We will see which the Empire chooses. He was dragged away into the corridors that led to the cells he had sent Lyra to. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. The hall began to empty slowly, nobles and counselors whispering among themselves, already calculating how this shift in power would affect their positions. Some looked at Kaelin with new respect, some with fear, most with the careful neutrality of people who would wait to see which way the wind blew before committing. Kaelin stood in the center of the emptying hall and felt the bond settle. Not relief, exhaustion. He had won the night, but the war was just beginning. Because Corvin was right about one thing, the Empire would have to choose, between a king who ruled through control and distance, or a king who ruled through connection and risk. Between stability built on isolation or strength built on trust. And Kaelin did not know which they would pick. Lyra stepped beside him. What happens now? Now we wait. The council will review the evidence. They will deliberate. And then they will decide whether I am a king protecting the Empire or a tyrant eliminating opposition. And if they decide wrong, then we fight. With what? With truth, with the bond, with the understanding that sometimes the only way to save something is to be willing to let it break and rebuild from the pieces. Lyra looked at him. And if it does not rebuild, then we will have tried, and that will have to be enough. They stood in the silence of the hall, two people who had met as sovereign and servant and become something else entirely, not equals in power, but equals in risk. And risk, Kaelin was learning, was the foundation of everything worth protecting. Outside, the city began to wake to rumors of what had happened in the citadel. Nobles sent messages to their estates. Soldiers repositioned. The empire held its breath and waited to see if the king who had stood alone for 15 years could survive standing with someone else. And in a cell beneath the council hall, Corvin Drell sat in darkness and smiled, because he had one more move, one final contingency that no one had seen coming, and when he played it, the empire would burn. Whether Kaelin survived the fire was just a question of whether he was willing to sacrifice everything he had built to save the one thing that mattered. Not the throne. The woman standing beside it. The choice was coming, and it would be absolute. The city held its breath for 3 days. 3 days of councils behind closed doors. 3 days of nobles sending coded messages to their estates. 3 days of Corvin Drell sitting in a cell beneath the citadel, silent and smiling, as if he were waiting for something the rest of them could not see. Kaelin did not sleep. He stood watch in his war room, reviewing reports that came in hourly. Troop movements in the outer provinces. Houses declaring loyalty or withholding it. The careful mathematics of power as it shifted and recalculated around the question of whether a bonded king could be trusted to rule. The bond made sleep impossible anyway. Every time Kaelin closed his eyes, he felt Lyra. Not thoughts, not words, just presence. The texture of her awareness folding into his. Fear, determination, exhaustion that went bone deep. She was in the chamber adjacent to his, resting under guard, but the bond made distance meaningless. He could feel her heartbeat synchronizing with his own, could sense when her breathing changed from waking to something that was not quite sleep, but close enough. It should have been intrusive. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing that had ever happened to him. Because the bond did not lie, did not perform, did not calculate what to reveal and what to hide. It simply existed. A connection that forced both of them to be exactly what they were without the armor they wore for everyone else. And that was terrifying in ways Kaelin had no words for. On the morning of the 4th day, Thane entered the war room with an expression that made Kaelin's chest tighten. The council has reached a decision. And they want you in the Hall of Succession. Now. Kaelin straightened. His body ached from days of standing. His mind felt like it had been stripped raw, but he moved anyway. Muscle memory carrying him through corridors that felt different now, heavier, as if the citadel itself was waiting to see if it would still belong to him by evening. Lyra met him outside the hall. She wore a simple dress, dark blue, with the silver ring still on her thumb. She looked like she had not slept either. Her eyes were shadowed, her shoulders tight, but she was there, and that mattered more than Kaelin knew how to say. They walked into the Hall of Succession together. The council was assembled in full. 12 seats. 12 faces that revealed nothing. Lady Saris sat at the center, her expression carved from marble. Beside her, Taryn and Cassida. The others he recognized but did not know well enough to predict. Corvin stood in the accused position at the center of the semicircle, his hands still bound, flanked by guards. He looked like he had spent 3 days in meditation rather than a cell. Calm, composed, untouched by anything resembling fear. Kaelin took his position opposite Corvin, with Lyra beside him and Thane a step behind. The hall filled with nobles and courtiers, cramming into every available space. This was not just a judgment, it was theater, a moment that would define the empire for the next generation. Lady Saris stood. King Kaelin Ardent Virion, this council has reviewed the evidence presented against Corvin Drell. We have examined financial records, testimonies, and communications. We have deliberated on the charges of treason, conspiracy, and manipulation of imperial law. Kaelin's hands were steady at his sides. But inside, the bond pulled tight, carrying echoes of Lyra's tension. Lady Saris continued, "The evidence is compelling. It demonstrates a pattern of behavior consistent with long-term planning designed to control the throne through manipulation of circumstance. The council finds sufficient grounds to support the charge of conspiracy." Relief flooded through Kaelin so fast it made him dizzy. But Lady Saris was not finished. However, the council also finds that your actions in arresting Corvin Drell without due process represent a violation of the imperial charter you yourself established. You deployed military force against a civilian advisor without council authorization. You acted unilaterally in a manner that bypasses the checks on royal authority, designed to prevent exactly this kind of overreach. The hall went silent. Kalen felt the ground shift beneath him. Lady Saris looked at him directly. Therefore, this council issues the following judgment. Corvin Drell is guilty of conspiracy and is hereby stripped of his position and authority. He will be exiled from the Empire, his assets seized, and his name struck from imperial record. Corvin's expression did not change. However, King Kalen Ardent Virion is found to have acted in violation of the Charter. While the Council acknowledges that your intent was to protect the Empire, intent does not excuse the erosion of legal process. Therefore, the Council imposes the following terms. You will submit to a Council of Oversight for a period of 2 years. During this time, all major decisions will require Council approval. You will not deploy military force without authorization. You will not arrest members of the Council or nobility without due process. Kalen stared at her. This was not victory. This was controlled defeat. They were allowing him to remain king, but only in name. The real power would belong to the Council, to the same system that had enabled Corvin in the first place. And if you refuse these terms, Lady Saris asked quietly, then the Council will vote to remove you from the throne and install a regency until a suitable successor can be determined. Kalen looked around the hall, every face watching him, waiting to see if he would accept the leash or burn everything down, fighting it. This was the choice Corvin had engineered from the beginning, not a choice between guilt and innocence, between control and chaos. Accept the Council's judgment and remain a puppet king, or reject it and prove you were everything they feared. There was no third option. Except there was. Kalen turned to Corvin. Before I answer, I have one question. Lady Saris frowned. This is not a negotiation. It is not a negotiation. It is a clarification. Kalen stepped closer to Corvin. You told Lyra that my parents' bond was their weakness, that it made them vulnerable, that someone used it to destroy them. Who? Corvin's smile widened. Does it matter? Yes. Why? Because if I am going to accept the Council's judgment, I need to know if the man who orchestrated my parents' assassination is standing in front of me or sitting behind me. The hall erupted. Guards moved toward Kalen, but Thane stepped between them, his hand on his sword. Lady Saris's voice cut through the chaos. That is a serious accusation. It is a serious question, one that has no bearing on the matter before this council. It has every bearing. Kalen did not take his eyes off Corvin. My mother was poisoned by someone she trusted. My father died of grief 3 months later. The empire nearly collapsed. Civil war erupted in 6 provinces. And I have spent 15 years believing that their bond was the weakness that killed them. He stepped closer. But it was not the bond. It was betrayal. Someone close enough to poison her wine, someone trusted enough that she did not see it coming, someone who benefited from the chaos that followed. Corvin's expression remained serene. You are reaching, my king. Am I? You were my father's junior advisor during the final year of his reign. You were present at the feast where my mother was poisoned. You were one of 3 people who survived the assassination attempt that followed. And you were the one who suggested that I write the imperial charter to prevent future kings from being compromised through emotional attachment. That was sound advice. It was strategic positioning. You spent 15 years making sure I remained unbonded so that I would remain controllable. And when the bond formed anyway, you activated a contingency designed to remove me and install someone you could manipulate more effectively. Corvin said nothing. Kalen turned to the council. Review his financial records from 15 years ago. Review the guest list from the feast. Review who benefited most from my parents' deaths and the chaos that followed. Lady Saris's face had gone pale. Even if what you suggest is true, it does not change the judgment before this council. It changes everything. Because if Corvian orchestrated my parents' deaths, then he has been planning this for longer than any of us realized. And the council has been taking advice from a man who has spent decades engineering the Empire's destruction, one calculated move at a time. Silence settled over the hall like ash. Then Corvin spoke, and his voice was different, colder, stripped of the veneer of civility. You want the truth, Kalen? Yes. I was there when your mother died. Yes, I suggested the charter. Yes. I have spent 15 years positioning you exactly where I needed you, Because your father was a conqueror who built an empire through force, and your mother was a strategist who believed connection was strength. Together, they were unstoppable. Separately, they were manageable. He smiled. I did not poison your mother myself, but I knew who did, and I made sure that person was never caught, because chaos was exactly what the empire needed. A reset. An opportunity to rebuild power structures around something more stable than the whims of bonded alphas who believed love was a form of governance. The hall was frozen. Corvin continued. So yes, I orchestrated this. All of it. Your isolation, your paranoia, the bond forming at exactly the moment that would cause maximum disruption. I planned for every outcome, every contingency, every possible move you could make. He looked at Lady Saris. And now the council has to decide. Do you honor the law and allow this confession to be investigated? Or do you recognize that the law is simply a tool, and the person holding it determines whether it builds or destroys? Lady Saris stood very still. You are confessing to treason and conspiracy in the assassination of the Queen. I am clarifying history. Then you will be executed. Perhaps. Or perhaps the council recognizes that executing me creates a power vacuum you are unprepared to fill, that my knowledge of imperial operations is too valuable to discard, that the systems I built are the only thing holding this empire together. He turned back to Kaelin. So here's the real choice, my king. You can demand my execution and watch the empire fracture as every house I have dirt on moves to protect themselves. Or you can accept the council's judgment, submit to oversight, and allow me to be exiled quietly while the empire pretends none of this happened. Either way, I win, because I built a system where truth is less valuable than stability, and stability will always choose the comfortable lie over the devastating reality. Kaelin stared at him and understood exactly what Corvin had done. He had not just engineered a coup, he had engineered a trap where justice itself became the enemy, where punishing him would cause more damage than letting him walk away, where the empire would have to choose between accountability and survival. And Corvin believed they would choose survival, because they always did. This was the corruption that ate empires from the inside, not dramatic betrayals or violent revolutions, just the slow erosion of principles in the name of pragmatism, the understanding that some truths were too expensive to acknowledge, that some crimes were too entangled to prosecute without bringing down everything around them. Kaelin had spent 15 years trying to build a system that could not be corrupted, and Corvin had spent those same 15 years proving that every system was corruptible if you understood the principles it was built on and were willing to exploit them without hesitation. But standing here, feeling the bond hum with Lyra's presence, Kaelin realized something Corvin had not accounted for. Some things mattered more than empires. Kaelin turned to Lady Saris. Execute him. My king, execute him. Investigate every house he has compromised. Expose every manipulation. Let the empire fracture if it must. But do not let the man who murdered my mother walk free, because we are too afraid of what truth costs. Lady Saris's voice was strained. That will destabilize everything. Then we rebuild from nothing, but we rebuild honestly. You are willing to risk civil war for revenge? Not revenge. Justice. There is a difference. Is there? Lady Cassida stood. Because from where I am standing, it looks like you are willing to destroy the empire to satisfy your own need for retribution, which proves exactly what Corvin has been saying, that you are compromised, that the bond has made you unable to govern rationally. Kaelin looked at her. Then remove me. Vote for regency. Install someone who will make the pragmatic choice and let Corvin go. But understand that when you do, you are proving that this empire has no principles, only calculations. And empires built on nothing but calculation do not survive. They just take longer to collapse. The hall was silent. Then Lyra spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. I have listened to all of you debate law and stability and what the empire needs, and I have one question. What are you protecting? Lady Saris frowned. The empire. No. You are protecting a system, a structure of power that benefits you. But the empire is not a system. It is people. And those people have watched nobles debate legal theory while they starve, have watched councils prioritize stability over justice, have watched kings and advisors play games with their lives as if they were pieces on a board. She stepped forward. Corvin told me that my death was policy, not personal, as if that made it acceptable, as if reducing someone's life to a calculation justified erasing them. And now you are telling me that his execution would be too destabilizing, that his crimes are too expensive to prosecute, that the Empire cannot afford to punish him. She looked around the hall. So I will ask again, what are you protecting? Because if the Empire cannot survive justice, then it does not deserve to. Silence. Absolute. Then Lord Terran stood. He looked old suddenly, tired, as if the weight of decades had finally caught up with him. The girl is right. Lady Saris turned to him sharply. Terran? No. He shook his head. I have sat on this council for 30 years. I have watched us make pragmatic choice after pragmatic choice, and each time we told ourselves it was for the good of the Empire, that stability required compromise, that justice was a luxury we could not afford. He looked at Corvin. But when we compromise justice often enough, we stop being an empire worth protecting. We become exactly what we claim to fight against, a system that devours its people in the name of its own survival. He sat down, and the hall shifted. Lady Cassida looked between them, her expression tight. If we execute Corvin, the houses he has compromised will move against us. The Empire will fracture. Then let it fracture, Kaelin said quietly, and let it reform around something other than fear. Lady Sarah stood very still. Then she looked at the council. All in favor of executing Corvin Drell for treason and conspiracy in the assassination of Queen Marin. Hands rose. Not all of them, but enough. 7-5. Lady Saris nodded slowly. Corvin Drell, you are sentenced to execution by beheading at dawn. Your assets will be seized. Your name will be struck from record. And every house you compromised will be investigated and held accountable. Corvin smiled. You have just destroyed your own empire. No, Kaelin said. We're giving it a chance to survive honestly. Corvin was led away by guards, his smile never faltering, as if even in defeat he believed he had won something no one else could see. Maybe he had. Because the chaos that followed was immediate and brutal. 3 houses withdrew their pledges of loyalty within hours. 2 provinces threatened secession. The council fractured along lines that had been stable for decades. The empire did not collapse, but it came close. And for 6 months, Kaelin fought a war that was not about territory or resources, but about whether an empire could survive being rebuilt on principles rather than power. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than surviving his parents' deaths. Harder than reclaiming the throne during civil war. Harder than standing alone for 15 years. Because this time he was not alone. And trusting others to carry the weight was more terrifying than carrying it himself. But slowly, the empire stabilized. Not because Kaelin forced it, because people chose it. Chose to believe that justice mattered more than expedience, that truth was worth the cost, that an empire built on accountability was stronger than one built on fear. It was not perfect, but it was honest. And honest, Kaelin was learning, was the only foundation that lasted. 1 year after Corvin's execution, Kaelin stood on the balcony overlooking the city and watched the sun set over Virolith. The citadel was quieter now. The council had been reformed. Houses that had enabled Corvin had been stripped of power. New voices had risen, voices that had spent lifetimes on the underside of empire and understood exactly what governance looked like when it served people instead of structures. It was messy, but it was real. Lyra stepped onto the balcony beside him. She wore a dress of deep gray, simple and elegant, with the silver ring still on her thumb. She had refused a formal coronation, refused the title of Luna in any official capacity. But the Empire called her that anyway, because titles were not given by councils. They were earned by actions. And Lyra had spent the last year doing what no one else would, speaking truth when it was uncomfortable, challenging decisions when they prioritized power over people, refusing to let the Empire slip back into the comfortable patterns that had enabled Corvin in the first place. She was not easy to work with, but she was impossible to ignore. The bond had settled over the year into something that felt less like invasion and more like partnership. Kaelin could still feel her presence, still sensed echoes of what she felt. But it no longer suffocated, it grounded, reminded him that decisions made alone were decisions that carried only his perspective, And perspective, he had learned, was the difference between governance and tyranny. "You are thinking too hard," Lyra said without looking at him. "I am always thinking. I know. It is exhausting." Kaelin almost smiled. "Is that why you came out here? To tell me I think too much?" "No, I came out here because Thane just informed me that House Volterra has formally requested an audience. They want to negotiate a new trade agreement." Kaelin turned to her. "Volterra was one of the houses that withdrew support." "Yes. And now they want back in. What did you tell Thane? That you would consider it?" "But that consideration does not mean acceptance. That they would have to prove they were willing to operate under the new terms." "Which are?" "Transparency. Accountability. No backroom deals. No manipulation of law for personal gain. They will hate that. Probably. But if they want access to Imperial resources, they will accept it." Kaelin studied her. "You have gotten good at this." "At what?" "Governance." Lyra shrugged. "I'm good at seeing when people are lying. Turns out that is most of what governance is. Deciding who is lying and why, and whether their lies serve something worth protecting. That is a cynical view. It is an honest one." They stood in silence, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as evening settled. Then Lyra spoke again, her voice quieter. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" "Choosing me. Choosing this. You could have submitted to the Council's oversight, could have kept the Empire stable, could have avoided everything that came after." Kaelin looked at her. "And what would I have become?" "A king." "No. A puppet. There is a difference." "You think what you have now is better?" Kaelin turned to face her fully. "I think what I have now is honest. And honesty is the only thing I have ever wanted, and the hardest thing I have ever found. Even if it cost you the Empire?" "The Empire I had was built on fear and isolation. If losing that means building something real, then yes. It was worth it." Lyra held his gaze. "You have changed. So have you. Have I? You walked into a throne hall with nothing and told a king he was wrong. Now you negotiate with houses and challenge councils and refuse to let anyone forget that power without conscience is just cruelty in expensive clothes. That sounds like you are giving me credit for your growth. Maybe I am. Because you forced me to grow. To see that the walls I built did not protect me. They just made me alone." Lyra's expression softened, just slightly, and alone was killing you, slowly. But yes, the bond hummed between them, carrying something that was not quite love but was close enough. Trust, partnership, the understanding that they had survived something most people did not, the collision of power and connection, the choice between safety and honesty. And they had chosen honesty, even when it cost them everything, especially then, because that was the test that separated those who ruled from those who led. Rulers chose safety. Leaders chose truth. And truth was the only thing that built foundations strong enough to survive generations. "Do you think it will last?" Lyra asked. "The Empire, the reforms, everything we fought for." Kaelin looked out over the city. "I do not know. But I know that we gave it a chance, and that is more than it had before. Is that enough? It has to be." They stood together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and shadow, and Kaelin understood something he had not known when this began. Strength was not the absence of fear or doubt or vulnerability. Strength was standing in the presence of all three and choosing to build anyway. Choosing to trust that the people beside you would carry the weight when you could not. Choosing to believe that connection was not weakness, but the only thing that made survival worth the cost. His parents had understood that, had built a reign on it, had died because someone weaponized it. But they had not been wrong. They had just been betrayed. And Kaelin had spent 15 years believing that the solution was to never trust anyone again. But the real solution was simpler and infinitely harder. Trust better. Choose people who valued truth over comfort, who would challenge you when you were wrong, who would stand beside you when the Empire itself turned against you. People like Lyra, like Thane, like the voices that had risen from the lower districts and refused to be silent anymore. The Empire was not saved by one king making one choice. It was saved by hundreds of people making the same choice over and over again, to demand better, to refuse the comfortable lie, to hold power accountable even when it cost them. That was the revolution Corvin had not anticipated. Not a change in leadership, a change in what the Empire believed it deserved. And belief, Kaelin was learning, was stronger than any army. Lyra turned to go inside. The council is meeting at dawn. You should sleep. I will try. That is not the same as succeeding. No. But it is all I have.
Lyra paused in the doorway. For what it is worth, you are better at this than you think. At what? Being human. Kaelin watched her disappear into the citadel, and allowed himself for the first time in longer than he could remember to believe it might be true. That the king who had stood alone for 15 years might actually survive standing with others. That the bond he had feared would destroy him was the only thing that had saved him.
That power was not control, but the willingness to share it with people who would use it honestly. The city spread below him, vast and complicated and absolutely imperfect. But it was still standing, and so was he. Not because he was stronger than everyone else, but because he had finally learned that strength was not something you hoarded. It was something you built together. One honest choice at a time, even when those choices cost you everything you thought you needed, especially then. Because the crown was not the empire. The people were. And people, Kaelin had learned, were far stronger than any system built to control them. They just needed someone willing to trust them enough to let them prove it. Kaelin took one last look at the city. Then he went inside to prepare for the council meeting, to face the next challenge, the next crisis, the next impossible choice. But this time he would not face it alone. And that made all the difference. Years later, when historians wrote about the reign of Kaelin Ardent Virion, they would argue about what defined it. Some would say it was the arrest of Corvin Drell and the execution that followed. Some would say it was the reforms that rebuilt the council. Some would say it was the bonding of a king to a servant and the empire that survived it. But those who had lived through it knew the truth. It was not one moment. It was the accumulation of choices made by someone willing to admit he was wrong and change anyway. Willing to trust that connection was not weakness. Willing to believe that the empire deserved better than fear disguised as stability. And most importantly, willing to understand that surviving was not the same as living. That a king who stood alone was not strong. He was just alone. And alone was the slowest way to die. Kaelin Ardent Virion learned that lesson the hard way, by nearly destroying everything to avoid it, by standing on the edge of execution and choosing differently, by trusting the bond when every instinct screamed to fight it, by building an empire that valued truth over comfort. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and honest was the only foundation worth dying for, or living for. The end was not an ending, it was a beginning. The empire rebuilt itself one honest choice at a time, and the king who had refused to choose for 3 years finally understood what his parents had known all along. Love was not weakness, fear of love was, and the moment you stopped being afraid, you stopped being alone. The throne hall of Virolith Citadel stood as it always had, but the man who sat on the throne was different, not because he was bonded, but because he had learned that the crown was not the weight he carried. It was the responsibility he shared, and that made all the difference.